Mr. Allen, if we could have the testimony from you, sir, and then Mr. Forman, and then I will have a series of questions for the panel.
Let us just say that a very rich man has purchased all the films ever made in Hollywood. He calls together his staff and says, "Take all the black and white ones and turn them into color using our new computer." The technicians get right to work implementing this because they are used to following orders. One man among them, however, is puzzled and asks his employer, "I don't understand, why paint them over in color?" And the boss says, "Because more people will watch them." "Really?" the underling asks. "Yes," the boss answers. "The American public is very stupid, very infantile. In fact, they're idiots. They can't enjoy a film unless it's full of bright colors and rock music. The story means nothing, the plot, the acting. Just give the fools red and yellows and they'll smile." The worker is confused and tells his boss that for generations people have been watching and adoring films in black and white. He points to It's a Wonderful Life, viewed by millions every Christmas on television. He points to Yankee Doodle Dandy and Sergeant York and Citizen Kane and the Maltese Falcon and On the Waterfront. "They're great films," the boss says, "but I'm going to improve them. They'll be greater when I'm finished with them." "But the director of Citizen Kane is dead. Who'll tell you what color to use?" "Well, we have men to do that. It's true they've never directed films and know nothing about it, but they sure can work computers, and between you and me, does it really make a difference if James Cagney's jacket is green or yellow when he shoots Humphrey Bogart in Public Enemy?" The poor underling is losing his resolve. "By the way," he asks, "you mentioned adding rock music." "Oh, that's in the future," the boss says. "First color, then maybe we replace the score of Gone with the Wind with rock. I have lots of ideas." Now, you might get the impression from all this that I'm against the colorization of black and white films, but believe it or not, you'd be wrong. If a movie director wishes his film to be colorized, then I say by all means let him color it. If he prefers it to remain in black and white, then it is sinful to force him to change it. If the director is not alive and his work has been historically established in black and white, it should remain true to its origin. The presumption that the colorizers are doing him a favor and bettering his movie is a transparent attempt to justify the mutilation of art for a few extra dollars. The colorizers will tell you that it's proven no one wants black and white, but this is of course not true, and if it were, if audiences who have grown up on mindless television were so desensitized that a movie like It Happened One Night, which has been delighting people in black and white for generations, now had to be viewed in color to be appreciated, then the task would be to cultivate the audience back to some level of maturity rather than to doctor the film artificially to keep up with lowered tastes. Not only do the colorizers have contempt for the American public, but also for the artists. A large number of American movies are classics both at home and all over the world. Thinking they were making popular entertainment, American filmmakers have produced numerous motion pictures that are considered genuine works of art, comparable to fine literature, painting, and music. But the colorizers have no regard for the men who made these movies, and when a great American director like John Huston says he doesn't want his superb mystery, The Maltese Falcon, made into a color movie because that makes this hard-boiled Bogart film silly-looking, they couldn't care less what Huston wants. The colorizers also tell us that a viewer can simply turn off the color and see the film in black and white. The fact that the man who made the film wants no one at all to see it in color means nothing to them. Finally, they say we live in a democracy and the public wants these films in color. But if members of the public had the right to demand alterations to suit their taste, the world would have no real art. Nothing would be safe. Picasso would have been changed years ago, and James Joyce and Stravinsky, and the list goes on. The example of John Huston, incidentally, is particularly meaningful to me because the aesthetic differences between color and black and white is a subject that hits home in my own work. In an era of almost exclusively color films, I have chosen on a number of occasions, even fought for the privilege of telling stories with black and white photography. Indeed, the different effect between color and black and white is often so wide it alters completely the meaning of scenes. If I had portrayed New York City in color rather than black and white in my movie Manhattan, all the nostalgic connotations would have vanished. All the evocation of the city from old photographs and films would have been impossible to achieve in glorious Technicolor. Whereas if I had filmed Annie Hall in black and white, all the scenes that now come off amusingly would take a giant step toward grim seriousness by mere virtue of them suddenly being grittier and less cartoon-like. One has only to think of a film like The Bicycle Thief and imagine the life and death search through post-war Rome for the precious bicycle being in reds and yellows and blues rather than the hot whites and dirty blacks and grays, and one sees how absurd the whole thing is. And it's not just drama. Musicals, just because they are bouncy, are not helped by the addition of color where it doesn't belong either. Part of the artistic experience of seeing old Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire films is the period quality. The black and white photography gives it its entire feel. When Astaire made color musicals in a later period, they have a totally different quality that reflects beautifully their particular era. They are not better or worse, but completely different and true to themselves. And what of the other insults? The editing, the artificial panning, the cuts made to accommodate the commercial sale of dog food and roach spray. Only in America are films so degraded. In other countries, the artist is often protected by the government. No one can change a French film director's film without his consent. They have too much respect for people who contribute to the society by doing creative work to allow anyone to subvert their creations at random. My personal belief is, of course, that no one should ever be able to tamper with any artist's work in any medium against the artist's will. And this principle can be argued justly by any citizen. It does not need a directly involved artist. The colorizers may think they have a legal loophole, but the morality of what they are doing is atrocious. For directors with enough clout to make self-protecting contracts, this is no problem. But for those less fortunate, and of course the deceased ones, protection must be guaranteed. If a producer insists on color, and a helpless director is forced to film it the studio's way despite his own feelings that it should be in black and white, well, a deal's a deal. But once a film exists in black and white and has been thrilling audiences for years, then to suddenly color it seems too great an insult, even for a society that is so often more in awe of its business executives than its creative talents. Ultimately, of course, the colorizers will lose this battle. If it's not immediately, then future generations will for sure discard these cheesy artificial symbols of one society's greed. They will, of course, go back to the great originals. And if we are foolish enough to permit this monstrous practice to continue, one can easily picture young men and women someday discussing us with disgust and saying, they did this and nobody stopped them? Well, there was a lot of money involved. But surely the people could see the deeper value to America of its film treasury and its image among civilizations. Surely they understood the immorality of defacing an artist's work against his will. Don't tell me it was the kind of nation that adored profit at any cost and humiliation. Here I finish because it's too early to know how it turns out, but I hope dearly that I will not be part of a culture that is one day ridiculed and reviled as a laughingstock.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Mr. Forman.
Mr. Chairman, I was born and I lived the first 37 years of my life in Europe, and thus I feel qualified to testify that the only United States ambassador who is welcomed with open arms and love and admiration by everybody everywhere is American film. The emotional impact American movies have on hundreds of millions of people everywhere every day is astonishing, and we all can be very proud of it. You give the audiences Hollywood glamour and they admire the glamour. You show them films showing our dark sides, criticizing ourselves, and they admire our freedom with which we can talk about ourselves. So whichever end of the stick you grab, the American film always wins, except at home. You can imagine how saddened I was when, after coming to the United States, I learned that this wonderful and proud ambassador of our culture, when they return home, and I mean the homes of people on television, they are treated by the money people not even as second-class citizens. They are treated as sausages on the butcher block. They are cut, they are colorized, they are panned, scanned, sped up, altered. And I myself learned it the hard way. I made a musical for United Artists, which was sold to 115 syndicated stations all over the country in the United States, with 9 entire musical numbers cut out and numerous little cuts here and there throughout the whole film. But interesting thing, my name was still on it. The film was still sold to the audiences for profit as an original, as a Milos Forman film. When I asked the lawyers if there is any way to protect my work against this mutilation, I was told, if you are not protected by your individual contract, there is nothing in American law which protects the rights of creative authors of motion pictures. Whoever buys them can do with them anything they wish. they can even sell them after the alterations as the original work. Well, it was shocking for me to discover that the creative authors of this genuinely American art form are much better protected in every other country in civilized world than they are in the United States. For example, if I commission a painting, and it doesn't matter if it is a Picasso or from an unknown, it is mine. I paid for it, and I can do anything. Anything, it's mine. I can do anything. Nobody, I own it. Nobody can protect the painting against me doing anything with it I wish. I can change colors. I can alter the lines. I can even cut a few inches here and there to accommodate better the space of my wall. But should I still be able to sell this Picasso or an unknown for profit as the original work? I believe not. I realize that I am hired and paid by the money people to make a film. But so was Michelangelo, whom Medici hired and paid to paint the Sistine Chapel. And still none of the Medicis went inside during the night and changed colors or repainted or otherwise altered Michelangelo's work. But of course, these were the Middle Ages. Or were they, right? Please understand one thing. I'm not saying that our films are untouchable, that nothing can be altered. Of course, everything can be altered. But the only person who should have the right to alter or supervise such alterations are the creative authors of the work, nobody else. Because otherwise we are leaving the civilized world and we are entering the jungle. For example, if we decide that colorization without the approval of the creative authors is permissible, because colorization changes neither the story, nor the characters, nor the original negatives of the film, leads immediately to interesting ideas, which Woody came up to the same one. Why not jazz up a little bit the music in Gone with the Wind? Kids are today heavily in heavy metal, so let's replace the soundtrack with electric guitars and drums. That will also not change neither the story, nor the characters, or the original negatives. And where it will go from there? Because technological progress will not stop. Who knows what will be possible with the visual and audio elements of the film tomorrow? My deep conviction is that if the creative authors of the films are not given the right to approve or disapprove any, and I emphasize the word any, alteration of his or her work, American film, this powerful part of American cultural heritage, will in the future be constantly humiliated and finally mutilated beyond recognition. Thank you for attention.
Thank you. Mr. Pollack, you've heard Ms. Rogers quote Jimmy Stewart as talking about the Easter egg dye aspect of it. Mr. Forman said at one point that colorizing films is like putting aluminum siding on a medieval castle. And Mr. Allen has stated very clearly how he feels. But movie directors also alter the work of other artists, do they not? I'm thinking of John Huston's famous film, The Maltese Falcon. Certainly, we would all agree, an absolute classic. But he changes the ending from the book. In Dashiell Hammett's 1929 novel has a different ending than John Huston's 1941 movie, To the Maltese Falcon. What about that?
Senator Leahy, we're perfectly in agreement with that kind of work. That's considered a new work. We say and credit it as a film based on a novel. I don't think anyone here would have an objection, they might if it didn't turn out well, of someone making a novel based on one of our films. As a matter of fact, movie studios constantly commission novelizations of films, and oftentimes they sell quite well. The movement from novel to film to play to comic book to ballet to symphony and back through that parade is perfectly acceptable to us. What is not acceptable to us is taking the book, The Maltese Falcon, rewriting pages of it, and saying that we've improved it without the consent of the author. That's a completely different thing than buying the rights from the author and saying, we're going to make a motion picture based on this book. This book remains forever as a book in its original form as it was originally intended by the novelist. But now a new piece of entertainment has been made, a new art form has been created, which is the motion picture version of that.
But let me follow a little bit more, though. You have, I'll take another book written by a good friend of mine, now deceased, lived in Vermont most of the end of his life, Bernard Malamud's book, The Natural. The ending of that was radically changed. It made a very popular movie. Enjoyed the movie, just I enjoyed the book, but they're an awful lot different. Now that, as I recall, the title is going up. It talks about The Natural, novel by Bernard Malamud, but it's entirely different. I mean, the whole thrust of the book is changed in the movies. Is that any different just because the film producer bought the book? I mean, can he make the argument that it can be changed any differently than, is that argument any different from him than, for example, Ted Turner saying, I bought the movie?
Well,
Now I can colorize, especially as I'm leaving available to anybody who wants to buy it, the original black and white version. It's still there. I haven't changed it. I mean, that's still there somewhere. Probably it's even been improved because they have to go through this process of getting a good, clear copy, as the testimony will be later on today. Why is it any different?
because the new work clearly states that it's a new work based upon the novel. The original work by the original author is not altered in any way whatsoever, and Bernard Malamud has there are no consequences to him. He does not have to deal in any way with the intentions of he is not judged. His artistic choices are not influenced in any way. His evaluation as an artist is not affected in any way. The representation of his body of work is not altered in any way whatsoever. This is a completely new work, the artistry of which has to be rejudged now by the people who have made those choices. It would be perfectly logical to criticize those choices or say, as you did and as many people in this country did, they liked the movie just fine. It wasn't The Natural that they read, it was a whole other piece of work, but that was fine with them. I have, in my own film career, attempted to make films often out of novels, and in many cases have had to, for one reason or another, change either details or overall concepts about it. But there's no subterfuge about it. There's no sense that I'm in any way accrediting this to the original author. I'm taking the responsibility now for creating a whole new work. And in that new work, as I said before in my testimony, I have to make new choices, too. So I don't feel that it is the same, Senator.
Well, then what if we took again the black and white movie, release it in a color version, and sit on it based on the movie such and such?
You would have to get new actors, or you'd have to write a new screenplay, or you'd have to redirect it. You can't take, I wouldn't take the pages out of the Malamud book and cut them out and paste them into the script. I mean, you just can't do that. At least I've hired a screenwriter, I've started a whole new work, and you'd have to do the same with a film. I don't have any objection, by the way, with the Colorizers doing that. If they want to make a brand new version of a Technicolor movie of any of the old black and white movies, that becomes a new work. But not the original version. You can't take the original version and just dip it in a vat of paint and say, you know, you just can't do it. It's an alteration and a violation of the original author's work.
Mr. Allen, how do you feel on basically the same question? How would you respond?
I think there's a tremendous difference between the two processes. If someone goes to Bernard Malamud and says, we'd like to buy your book and convert it into a film, he has a free choice as to whether to sell that or not sell the rights to it. The book remains constantly the book. and he has the choice as to whether to allow it to be transferred to a completely different medium. If he allows it to be transferred, if he sells the rights, then he has to realize possibly requirements of the new art form may, or the different art form may require changes in the book, changes in the story. But he does this of his own free will. Now, if someone came to me and said, we'd like to take your film and make it into color, and this will require certain artistic choices that we're going to make and all that, I just want the option to say yes or no. And that's the option that Malamud has.
Well, let me follow a little bit on that. A director, if he's got enough clout, can protect himself through a contract. You've been able to do that. You talked about early in your testimony about fighting for the right to make a black and white film. You've had a record of successes, and you've been able to do that. Somebody else might not be able to make that kind of a fight, but you've been able to do it. You protected yourself in other ways through contract. You prevented the editing of your films, as I understand, for television. Am I correct on that?
Many of them, yes.
You're part of a group that purchased a Japanese film which was already dubbed in English. You then took the dialogue out and put in your own script, What's Up, Tiger Lily. Could an argument be made that the marketplace itself is going to settle these issues? That a Woody Allen or a Milos Forman or a Sidney Pollack or anybody else might say, if they're going to direct a film, they're going to write into the contract and say, you ain't going to change it. Unless, I agree, you're not going to change it for another medium. You're not going to change it for showing on an airline. You're not going to change it showing on television. You're not going to change the soundtrack. You're not going to change the type of sound. You're not going to change it from black and white to color or color to black and white. Why couldn't that just be something that will eventually be handled in the marketplace?
Well, to some degree it's handled in the marketplace, but the issue is much deeper than that. There are some directors that can control their work, and they're very fortunate. It's a very hard fight, and very few really have the clout to have complete control over their films. It's a very difficult fight. There are many directors that don't have that power and will never have it, and there are some that are deceased and their films exist. And this is a very strong moral issue that's raised here. It isn't just an issue that's okay in the marketplace because those directors that have enough success financially can dictate terms in their next contract. The issue is large enough so that there should be an overriding principle that everyone adheres to that takes into account what's justifiable and what's not, and that is the protection and the respect given to American artists in any medium.
How do you respond to the argument made by some who have supported the colorization process that directors allow others, especially the TV networks, to tamper with their movies all the time? So the question I asked Mr. Silverstein
Yeah, I would
earlier.
respond in part, certainly the same way Mr. Silverstein did, that it's been a tough fight, and the Directors Guild have been fighting this for years. It's very hard. If the directors could have their way, they would not let any tampering with their film exist whatsoever. They would not let it be broken up for commercials or shortened or panned and scanned or colorized, certainly. The problem is that they haven't been able to do it, and the situation has gotten worse and worse and more insulting over the years, and now the colorization is just, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back because it's so horrible and so dramatic. It's such a preposterous thing. You know, it's so much more acutely noticeable to audiences, and so the issue has just exploded now completely. But directors, I know I, for one, in negotiating personal contracts, always try and keep my films off commercial television if I possibly can, and only allow them to be shown on cable networks where there can't be any tampering to the film whatsoever. This is a personal thing, but every director would would like to be able to do that and should have the right to do that. And if you take 2 lines out of a film or speed up a few minutes, it's a very ugly thing, but it's not as perceptible to the audience as colorization of films. And as I say, directors have been objecting to this and fighting furiously against it for years, but now that something so tremendously obvious is occurring as colorization, the issue can no longer be swept under the table. It's got to be settled finally in some legal fashion to give some measure of protection to American film artists.
But wasn't, of course, as a practical matter, some of this is dictated purely by economics. Is not. I mean, some films, the only way that they recover their cost of production is to be shown, to have them shown on television or in the on the airplanes in a foreign market, sold to cable television, but certainly sold in a number of areas where they are going to be changed, where they are going to be broken up and change around.
Yes, you'll always be able to give practical reasons, and there are a number of practical reasons why the economics dictate certain things, but the overriding reason is a moral reason that's much more profound than any of the practical reasons, and that is you can't have a culture where people can go in at will and mutilate artists' work no matter what excuse they give you. When somebody agrees to do a film with a film director, a film studio, or a producer, they're adults, and they realize they're putting up $5 million or $25 million, and they may lose it. That's possible. And just to do anything you want with the finished product, to just ride roughshod over the finished product in some frantic effort to try and minimize your loss or recoup your financial investment is perhaps something that appeals to the investors, but they've got to look to the deeper principle here, and that is that one cannot have a society in which the artists are so regarded that their work can simply be changed at will by other people. That's got more resonant overtones to the well-being of the society than the fact that in the film business some films make money and some films lose money.
Mr. Allen, what if the director wanted to change it? What if the director decided, look at this technology, I made this film in black and white for whatever reason, economic or anything else, I'd like to change it to color. Any problem there?
None whatsoever. I've spoken to certainly one quite famous international director, an Italian director, who's thrilled over the new technology because he wants to go back on some of his black and white films and color them. And that's fine. I'm just in favor of the artist having the choice. The new technology in the service of the artist is wonderful, but in the service of people who are not the originators of the film, it's a weapon.
What if the producer said no at that point?
If the producer said no, I personally believe that the producer should not be able to say no. Ultimately, what we'd all like to have in the best of all worlds is that the artist, the director in this case, would have the ultimate say over the work. When the producer makes his arrangement with the artist, when he makes his deal to do the film, he's trusting the director and putting his life and his money in the director's hands, and he has an option whether to do that or not based on the director's reputation and skill. And once he commits to that, he's committing to the director saying what the final product will be.
Your reference to the Italian director, I suspect I probably know the one you speak of. I can think of one especially with a number of black and white films, but you see that sort of analogous to what D.W. Griffith did after the talkies or sound came into films, where he actually went back and re-edited some of his own films, put in overlaid sound and music, dialogue into them.
Right, but think of the difference between Griffith doing it voluntarily, feeling that he could make a further artistic contribution to the product, and the business people coming in and taking Birth of a Nation and them doing it without Griffith's consent. It's simply all the difference in the world.
My last question, I know Mr. Silverstein wants to refer to this too, but last question is, we're talking about movies, the format. What about old television shows? They were made in black and white because that was basically the only thing to make them in at one time. What about what's your position on the colorization of those?
Well, oddly enough, since it is a principle that we're talking about, I think it has to cover, you know, everything that's made in black and white, or every artist's work, or every creator's work. I mean, the term artist is, you know, debatable and vague, but every creator's work has got to be protected, whether it's an old I Love Lucy show or an old Leave It to Beaver or something that
Half-Gun Will Travel.
That's right. You wouldn't think of that. You tend not to think of that in the same class as Citizen Kane or something by Kurosawa or Fellini. But the truth is, the principle is so deep that it must cover all of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. Mr. Silverstein.
Senator, I'd like to call your attention to the next step that the computer is liable to take, which should give this whole country pause, including the political community, putting aside for a moment the interests of the artistic community. The quote I'm going to give you is from a book on special effects by Christopher Finch. It relates to the uses of the Cray computer. And it says, our notion is to use the computer to create lifelike characters who are modeled after known personalities. It will take 5 or 10 years to solve the problems, but it will be possible to create the likeness of a human being with such a degree of precision that the viewer won't be able to tell what's wrong with it. It's not just the appearance either. It'll be possible to generate speech electronically, and the result will evoke an emotional response. We may be able to recreate stars of the past, Clark Gable or Rita Hayworth, cast them in new roles, bring them forward into time, into new settings. If stills and old films can be used to make the likeness, the database, you only have to encode once. Then you've got John Wayne, say, on file. You can put him in any role you simulate. I personally asked a gentleman associated with this company how far he could go, and I saw a demonstration of an early phase in this, and it's quite impressive. He said to me, and it was quite frightening to me, that he could make the President of the United States make any statement he wished to at this point, and the only difficulty he was having was encoding the drapery on his clothes. We have one final...
Didn't Mr. Allen do this with Zelig already?
Pardon me?
Didn't Mr. Allen already do this with his movie Zelig?
It was with my consent that I did it.
But not Calvin Coolidge's.